It was a cold autumn evening when Linda sat across from her son, Daniel, in their small but cozy home. The dim light from the chandelier cast long shadows on the walls, adding to the weight of the conversation she was about to have. She had spent all day rehearsing the words, but now, sitting here, facing her only son, they felt heavier than she had imagined. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice carrying the slightest tremble, "I need to tell you something." Daniel barely looked up from his phone. At 25, he was still living with her, convinced that struggling through life was unnecessary when he had the comfort of home. He had a job, but spent most of his money on nights out, new gadgets, and designer clothes. "I'm listening," he said, not bothering to make eye contact. Linda took a deep breath, gripping her hands together. "I lost my job today." That got his attention. His eyes snapped up and his brows furrowed. "Wait, what? How?" "There were layoffs," she explained, forcing a small, sad smile. "The company had been struggling for months. I held on as long as I could, but today they let me go." Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. So what now? How are you going to pay the bills?" Linda hesitated. "I have some savings, but I'll need to be careful with spending until I figure things out." His lips pressed into a thin line. "No offense, Mom, but I can't live like that. I have my own life to think about. I can't be stuck here pinching pennies because you lost your job." A pang of hurt shot through Linda's chest. She had given this boy everything, worked extra shifts to send him to college, helped him when he struggled to find a job, and never once asked for anything in return. And now, when she needed his understanding the most, he was acting like this? "I just need some time," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll find something else soon." Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms. "Look, I don't mean to sound harsh, but I think it's time you figured things out on your own. I mean, you're an adult, right?" Linda stared at him, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" He exhaled heavily, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. "I'm saying you should move out. This is my place now. If you can't afford it, you should find somewhere else to go." Silence filled the room. The words hung between them, suffocating in their cruelty. Linda felt as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. "Daniel," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "This is my home. I raised you here." "And I appreciate that," he said, standing up. "But I can't carry you. You're old enough to figure things out." Linda swallowed back the lump in her throat. She had never felt pain like this before. Not when she worked double shifts just to afford his tuition, not when she skipped meals so he could have enough to eat, and not even when she lost her job today. But this cut deeper than anything. She stood up slowly, nodding as if processing his words. "I understand," she murmured, her voice almost too calm. "Good," Daniel said, picking up his phone again. "I mean, you'll be fine, right? You always figure things out." Linda didn't respond. She simply turned, walking toward her bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. What Daniel didn't know, what he hadn't even cared to ask, was that she had just received something unexpected that morning. A settlement from an old legal dispute had finally gone through. $8 million. And now, as she sat on the edge of her bed, wiping away a tear, a new thought entered her mind. Daniel had made his decision. Now it was time for her, Yuha, to make hers. Linda sat on the edge of her bed, her mind racing with thoughts she never imagined she'd have. The weight of her son's words pressed down on her like a boulder. Move out? Find somewhere else to go? She had sacrificed everything for him, and the moment she needed even a fraction of that support in return, he cast her aside like an inconvenience. She stared at the envelope on her nightstand, the letter that had arrived earlier that day, before the world she knew crumbled. The settlement letter confirming that she had just inherited $8 million, from a long-disputed legal case involving her late parents' property. She had barely processed the news before she was hit with the devastating blow of losing her job. And now, just hours later, her only son had turned his back on her. Linda picked up the letter and read it again, almost in disbelief. The zeros seemed to blur together. She wasn't broke. She wasn't helpless. She had more financial security now than she ever dreamed of. But that wasn't what mattered most. What hurt the most was the realization that Daniel didn't see her as his mother anymore. He saw her as a burden. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. Crying wouldn't change anything. She had spent too many years bending over backward for him, only for him to treat her like this. A new feeling began to rise in her chest. Not sadness, not grief, determination. Daniel needed to learn a lesson he would never forget. She stood up, squared her shoulders, and took a deep breath. She had been weak for too long, always forgiving, always giving, always excusing his selfish behavior. That ended tonight. Linda stepped out of her bedroom and walked back into the living room, where Daniel was lounging on the couch, flipping through his phone as if nothing had happened. The same couch she had saved up to buy, in the home she had worked 2 jobs to afford, and yet he acted like he owned everything. He didn't even glance up when she entered the room. She cleared her throat. "Daniel." He didn't look up. "I'll be out of here by the end of the week," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Since you think I need to figure things out on my own, I won't waste any more of your time." That got his attention. He looked up, surprised. "Wait, really?" She nodded. "You don't have to worry about me anymore." A slow smirk spread across his face. "That's probably for the best, Mom. You'll be fine." He stretched his arms, completely oblivious to the storm brewing behind her composed expression. Linda turned and walked away, but before she reached her room, she said one last thing over her shoulder. "Oh, and Daniel, the rent is due in 2 weeks. It's all yours now." She heard his scoff. Yeah, I got it." "We'll see," she thought. That night, Linda didn't sleep much. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about every sacrifice she had made for Daniel, every late night at work, every dollar she saved to give him a better life, every time she put his needs before her own. And for what? To be tossed aside the moment she needed him? By morning, her mind was made up. She called a real estate agent and asked for a list of luxury properties in the area. She didn't need a mansion, just something beautiful, comfortable, and far away from this toxic situation. Then, she made a few more calls: a lawyer, a financial advisor, a moving company. She was setting herself up for a new life, and Daniel would have no idea what was coming. For the next few days, she packed her belongings, moving with a quiet efficiency that surprised even herself. She didn't tell Daniel what she was doing. She didn't need to. He barely paid attention, assuming she was just leaving like he had demanded. On the 4th day, a black luxury car pulled up in front of the house. The driver stepped out and began loading her suitcases into the trunk. Linda took one last look at the home she had built, the home where she had raised her son. Then she walked to the front door, turned the key, and left without a word. It wasn't until later that evening that Daniel realized she was really gone. He had assumed she was bluffing, that she'd come crying back, asking him for help. But when he walked into her empty bedroom and saw that everything was gone, a strange feeling settled in his stomach. For the first time, panic crept into his chest. Where had she gone? And more importantly, how was he supposed to pay for everything now? Daniel sat on the couch, staring at the empty space where his mother's belongings used to be. The room felt different, quieter, colder. He hadn't expected her to actually leave. Not like this, not without a fight, without tears, without begging him to reconsider. She had just walked away. At first, he shrugged it off. He convinced himself that this was for the best. His mom would figure things out, and he wouldn't have to deal with her problems anymore. But as the hours passed, an unsettling realization crept over him. He wasn't ready to be on his own. His mother had always handled the bills. Sure, he worked, but he had never actually managed the household expenses. He had assumed she didn't have much money, which was why he had told her to figure things out on her own. He thought she'd struggle, maybe even apologize, and come back. But now, as he scrolled through his banking app, his stomach twisted. The rent was due in 2 weeks. So were the utility bills. And then there was the car payment, the groceries, the internet, things he had never even thought about before. His paycheck barely covered his personal expenses. For the first time, true panic settled in. He pulled out his phone and called his mum. Straight to voicemail. He texted her, "Hey, where are you staying?" No response. He sent another. "Mum, I just want to know you're okay." Still nothing. He tried to brush off the unease gnawing at his chest. Maybe she just needed space. He'd figure it out. He was an adult after all. But over the next few days, reality hit him hard. The fridge was emptier than he realized. He hadn't bought groceries in weeks because, well, Mom always did that. Now he had to budget every dollar just to afford meals. The house got messier, laundry piled up, dishes sat in the sink. It wasn't that he was lazy, he just never realized how much his mom had done behind the scenes. Then, the first overdue notice arrived. Electric bill, past due, pay immediately to avoid disconnection. His heart pounded. He barely had enough in his account to last him through the week, let alone cover bills. He had no choice. He had to call her. He tried again, straight to voicemail. He left a message. "Mom, listen, I think we should talk. Maybe I overreacted. Just call me back." Hours passed. Nothing. Daniel swallowed his pride and called his aunt, his mother's older sister. "Have you heard from Mom?" he asked, trying to sound casual. There was a pause. "She's fine." That was it. Nothing more. No details. Daniel frowned. "Where is she?" "She's taking some time for herself." Something about his aunt's tone made him uneasy. His mother wasn't couch surfing or struggling. She was choosing to ignore him. And for the first time, it truly hit him. He had kicked her out. She hadn't begged to stay. She hadn't asked him for help. She had left, and she wasn't looking back. The guilt started creeping in, but he pushed it away. He needed a solution. He needed money. Over the next few days, Daniel scrambled to find a way out of the mess he had created. He asked a few friends for loans. Most of them made excuses. They weren't about to hand over cash to someone who had never had to struggle before. He tried selling a few things, his gaming console, a designer watch his mom had gifted him years ago, but it wasn't enough. Then, the final blow came. His landlord knocked on the door. Daniel opened it, forcing a smile. "Hey, Mr. Carson?" Carson, an older man with tired eyes, didn't smile back. "Rent's due in a few days." "Yeah, I know," Daniel said quickly. "I'm working on it. Just had some unexpected stuff come up." Carson sighed. "Look, kid, I know your mom always paid on time, but if you can't cover the rent, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. No exceptions." Daniel felt like the floor had been ripped from beneath him. Leave? Him? The irony nearly knocked the breath out of him. He had kicked his mother out, and now, just weeks later, he was in the exact same position. Desperation clawed at him. He had no backup plan, no savings, no one to bail him out. He had always thought of himself as independent. But now, standing in that doorway, he felt small, lost. When the landlord left, Daniel sat in silence, staring at the eviction notice in his hands. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what his mother must have felt when he told her to leave. Shame burned in his chest, and for the first time, he whispered words he never thought he'd say. I was wrong. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the eviction notice still in his hands. His fingers tightened around the paper, crumpling its edges as he stared at it in disbelief. How had everything spiraled out of control so quickly? Just weeks ago, he had felt in charge, confident that kicking his mother out was the right decision. Now he was staring at the very same fate. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He had to fix this, but how? He had already sold his most valuable possessions, borrowed what he could, and worked extra hours. Nothing was enough. His stomach clenched as another realization hit him. He had no one to turn to. His friends, the ones he used to go out with, had disappeared the moment he needed help. The people he thought he could rely on were suddenly too busy to answer his calls. And his mother, she was gone. He had been so certain she would call, that she would need him to survive. But instead, she had vanished, leaving him to deal with the mess he had created. He scrolled through his phone again, hovering over her contact. His thumb hesitated. He had already called her a dozen times, texted her even more. No response. He sighed and stood up, pacing the apartment. His mind raced. There had to be something he was missing. Then a thought hit him. His mum's old job. She had worked at the local real estate firm for nearly 15 years before she lost her job. But something about it had always seemed off. The way she had told him, so calm, so unemotional. It hadn't made sense. Maybe she had gotten a severance package, some savings, anything. He grabbed his keys and rushed out the door, heading straight for her old workplace. The office was a sleek building on the nicer side of town. He had been here a few times before, mostly when his mother had forgotten something at work and asked him to pick it up. He pushed open the door and walked up to the receptionist. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper attitude. "Can I help you?" she asked, barely glancing up from her computer. Yeah. I'm looking for someone who worked here. Karen Davis. She was let go a few weeks ago." The woman finally looked up, her brows raising slightly. "Karen Davis?" Daniel nodded. The receptionist scoffed. "She wasn't let go." His stomach dropped. "What?" "She resigned." Daniel's mouth went dry. "No, she told me she lost her job." The receptionist gave him a strange look. "Well, she didn't. She quit." Daniel felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. His mother had lied to him. But why? His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. His mom had worked at this job for years. She had always said she liked it. Why would she suddenly leave? Unless... A terrible thought crept into his mind. What if she had found something better? What if she had money? What if she had been testing him this whole time? His hands clenched into fists. If she had money and still let him suffer like this, then... He pushed the thought aside and turned back to the receptionist. "Do you know where she went? Did she take another job?" The woman shrugged. "No idea, but if she left, it probably wasn't for another office job." Daniel left the building in a daze, his thoughts a tangled mess. His mother had walked away from everything, her job, her home, him. But where had she gone? He drove aimlessly through town, hoping to spot her somewhere, but it was useless. He didn't even know where to look. Finally, he did the one thing he had been avoiding all week. He drove to his aunt's house. The moment she opened the door and saw him standing there, her expression hardened. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said, leaning against the doorframe. Daniel swallowed. "Where is she?" His aunt crossed her arms. "Why?" "Because..." His voice cracked, but he forced himself to keep talking. "Because I need to talk to her. Please." She studied him for a long moment, then sighed and stepped aside. "She's not here," she said as he walked inside. Daniel's heart sank. Do you know where she is? His aunt hesitated, then she shook her head. Even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. Anger flared in his chest. Why? She's my mother. His aunt's eyes darkened. And you kicked her out. Daniel's jaw clenched. I made a mistake. She scoffed. A mistake? Daniel, you didn't just hurt her. You abandoned her. She gave you everything, and the moment she needed you, you threw her away. Guilt crashed over him like a wave. He had been trying to ignore it, trying to justify what he had done, but hearing it out loud made it real. His aunt sighed and walked over to the kitchen table, grabbing a small envelope. She handed it to him. She left this for you. Daniel hesitated before opening it. Inside was a letter, written in his mother's neat handwriting. Daniel, I won't call you because I know you're not ready to talk, but I want you to know that I'm okay. You always believed I needed you, that without you, I would struggle. But the truth is, I spent my whole life making sure you never had to struggle, and maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I made things too easy for you. So now it's your turn to stand on your own. I'm not coming back, but I hope one day you understand why. Mom Daniel's hands shook as he read the words. His chest felt tight, his throat dry. She was really gone. And this time, it wasn't because she had to leave. She had chosen to. Daniel sat in his car, gripping the letter in his trembling hands. The words blurred as he read them, over and over, his mind struggling to process the reality before him. His mother was gone, not because she had nowhere else to go, not because she had no other choice, but because she chose to leave him behind. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt truly alone. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. How had it come to this? How had he gone from being the one in control to the one being left behind? He had always believed his mother needed him, that without him, she would be lost. But it turned out she had been stronger than he ever gave her credit for, and now he was the one drowning. The eviction notice loomed in his mind like a death sentence. He had days left before he was thrown out onto the streets. His friends had abandoned him. His job barely paid enough to keep up with rent. And now the one person he had always assumed would be there, his mother, had vanished. A sharp knock on his window jolted him from his thoughts. He turned to see his aunt standing outside, arms crossed, eyes filled with something between pity and disappointment. With a sigh, he rolled down the window. "You read it?" she asked. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yeah." His aunt studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "I still can't believe you did that to her." Daniel flinched. He was tired of hearing that, tired of being reminded of what he had done. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he muttered. "The right thing?" His aunt let out a dry chuckle. "Throwing your own mother out on the street because she lost her job? Tell me, Daniel, where's the right in that?" He had no answer. His aunt sighed and leaned against the car door. "She didn't lose her job, you know. She quit." Daniel tensed. "I know. I found out today." She raised an eyebrow. And I don't understand why." His aunt sighed, shaking her head. "You really don't get it, do you?" "Then explain it to me," Daniel snapped, his frustration bubbling over. "Tell me why she walked away from everything, why she lied to me, why she—" His voice cracked. "Why she left me." His aunt's gaze softened. "Because she finally saw you for who you are." Daniel recoiled as if he had been slapped. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" His aunt sighed, running a hand through her graying hair. "Your mom spent her whole life taking care of you. She sacrificed everything to make sure you had a good life, and you repaid her by throwing her out the moment she needed you." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "I thought she'd need me to come back. I thought—" "You thought she was helpless," his aunt interrupted. "You thought she couldn't survive without you. But Daniel, your mother is stronger than you ever gave her credit for." A heavy silence settled between them. After a long moment, his aunt exhaled sharply and shook her head. "She didn't quit her job because she was struggling. She quit because she no longer had to work." Daniel's heart stopped. "What?" His aunt hesitated before finally saying, "She came into some money." His stomach twisted. "How much?" His aunt hesitated before answering. $8 million. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His ears rang. His vision swam. $8 million. That couldn't be right. His mother had always lived paycheck to paycheck. She had worked long hours, made sacrifices, cut corners just to make ends meet. There was no way she had that kind of money. "You're lying," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. His aunt shrugged. "Believe what you want," but she didn't want to tell you. She knew exactly how you'd react. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. His mind raced. His mother had been rich this entire time, while he had been struggling to make ends meet, while he was on the verge of losing everything, and she had said nothing. His jaw clenched. His hands shook with anger. "She let me suffer," he growled. His aunt's expression darkened. "Number. She let you face the consequences of your own actions." Daniel stared at her, his anger shifting into something deeper, something uglier. His mother hadn't abandoned him. She had taught him a lesson, and he had walked right into it. He gritted his teeth, shoving the letter into his pocket. "Where is she?" His aunt sighed. "I told you, I'm not telling you that." Daniel slammed his fists against the steering wheel. "She left me with nothing." "No, Daniel," his aunt said, her voice cold. "She left you with exactly what you gave her." Silence. His aunt straightened, turning to walk away. "I hope you figure it out before it's too late." And with that, she was gone. Daniel sat there, his body rigid with rage, frustration, and something else. Something deeper. Regret. He had always believed he was the one in control, that he held all the power. But in reality, his mother had been holding back, and now she had turned the tables. Daniel sat in his darkened apartment, staring at the eviction notice that lay on the table before him. His mother's words echoed in his mind, tormenting him. "She left you with exactly what you gave her." His fists clenched. The rage bubbling inside him hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. How could she do this? How could she walk away knowing he was struggling, knowing he had nothing? The thought of his mother living in luxury while he faced homelessness made his blood boil. He had made a mistake. He could admit that now, but she had abandoned him instead of forgiving him, instead of helping him when he needed her the most. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through his contacts. His aunt had refused to tell him where his mother was, but there had to be someone who knew, someone who had seen her, spoken to her. He called his cousin Lisa. She picked up after a few rings. "Daniel?" Her voice was cautious. "Lisa," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I need to talk to Mom. Do you know where she is?" A long silence. "No," Lisa finally said, but there was hesitation in her voice. "You're lying," she sighed. "Daniel, she doesn't want to talk to you." His grip on the phone tightened. "I just need to see her. I need to explain." Lisa hesitated again. "Explain what? That you regret kicking her out now that you're the one struggling?" His jaw clenched. "It's not like that." Lisa let out a bitter laugh. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it seems exactly like that." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to push down the anger. "Please, Lisa, just tell me if you've seen her." Another pause. "I saw her once," Lisa admitted. "She looked happy." His stomach twisted. "Happy?" "Yes," Lisa said. "She was glowing, Daniel. She looked younger, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders." Daniel swallowed hard. Did she say anything about me?" Lisa sighed. She didn't talk about you much, but when she did, she sounded disappointed. The words cut deeper than he expected. Lisa, please, I need to make this right. Another silence. Then Lisa spoke, her voice softer this time. She's staying in a hotel, a nice one, the kind of place she never would have gone to before. I don't know if she's still there, but it's the Grand Lexington. Daniel's heart pounded. Thank you, he said quickly before hanging up. An hour later, Daniel stood outside the Grand Lexington Hotel, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. The place was luxurious, far beyond anything his mother could have afforded before. She really had $8 million. The thought still made his head spin. Taking a deep breath, he walked through the glass doors. The lobby was grand, with chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and plush carpets lining the floor. He felt out of place, like an intruder. He approached the front desk. A well-dressed receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. Good evening, sir. How can I assist you? I'm looking for my mother, Daniel said, his voice strained. Her name is Margaret Brooks. She's staying here. The receptionist's smile didn't waver. I'm sorry, sir, but we can't disclose guest information. Daniel gritted his teeth. Please, I just need to see her. It's important. I understand, she said, her tone sympathetic, but we have strict policies regarding guest privacy. Frustration boiled inside him. He was so close. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her, his mother. She stepped out of the elevator, dressed in an elegant blouse and slacks. Her hair was styled, her posture relaxed. She looked radiant, nothing like the exhausted woman who had once worked double shifts to keep food on the table. For a moment, he just stared. Then, as if sensing his presence, she turned. Their eyes met. Her expression didn't change. No shock, no anger, just calm indifference. She walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. Daniel. His throat felt tight. Mum. She studied him for a moment, then glanced at the eviction notice in his hand. A knowing look crossed her face. I see, she said simply. Daniel's fingers tightened around the paper. Mum, I need to talk to you. She nodded. All right, let's sit. She led him to the hotel lounge, where they settled into a quiet corner. A waiter approached, but his mother waved him off. Daniel struggled to find the right words. I messed up, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. His mother tilted her head slightly. And? His heart pounded. I know I hurt you. I was wrong. I shouldn't have done what I did. She watched him silently. He swallowed hard. Mum, I'm losing everything. My job barely covers rent. I got an eviction notice today. His voice cracked. I need help. Still, she said nothing. Please, he whispered. I know I don't deserve it, but His mother leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. Daniel, she said softly, do you remember what you told me the night you kicked me out? He hesitated. I don't. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw pain behind her calm exterior. You told me I was a burden, that I had nothing to offer, that you weren't responsible for me anymore. Shame flooded him. He looked down. His mother exhaled. Do you know why I didn't tell you about the money? He shook his head. Because I wanted to see who you truly were when I had nothing to give you. His stomach dropped. I wanted to know if you loved me because I was your mother, or because of what I could do for you, she continued. And Daniel, you showed me exactly where I stood. His chest ached. Mum, I do love you. You were just what? She interrupted. Comfortable? Secure? In control? He swallowed hard. She sighed, shaking her head. I spent my whole life taking care of you. When I needed you for the first time, you turned your back on me. Daniel's hands trembled. I made a mistake. His mother leaned back. Yes, you did. Silence stretched between them. Then she stood up. "I won't see you homeless, Daniel," she said. "But I also won't reward cruelty." He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "I'll pay your rent for 1 more month," she continued. "That's it." His stomach twisted. "Mom, I need more than that. She held up a hand. "That's all I'm offering." Daniel's shoulders slumped. His mother gazed at him one last time. "This is the last thing I'll ever do for you, Daniel. After this, you're on your own." Then without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him with nothing but regret. Daniel sat alone in the dimly lit hotel lounge, staring at the empty seat his mother had just left. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands clenched into fists. He had come here expecting to fix things, to beg if necessary, but instead she had walked away. Again, he had expected anger from her, maybe even sadness, but that calm, indifferent look in her eyes, that had shaken him more than he cared to admit. It was as if she had already grieved the loss of their relationship and moved on. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. 1 more month, that's all she was giving him. 30 days to figure out what came next. 30 days before he lost everything. He pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through his contacts. He had called every friend he had, every distant family member, but no one was willing to help. His pride had kept him from asking before. But now, pride wouldn't keep a roof over his head. He opened his messages and stared at the last conversation he had with his boss. "Daniel, hey, any chance I could pick up extra shifts this week?" "Boss, sorry man, business is slow. Can't justify the hours right now." He cursed under his breath. He needed a plan. As he sat there, his mind drifted back to his mother. How different she had looked. How at peace she seemed. He had never seen her like that before. All those years of struggle, of sacrifice, gone. She had everything now, and he had nothing. A bitter thought crossed his mind, one he tried to push away but couldn't ignore. She had $8 million. $8 million. And yet, all she was giving him was 1 month's rent. He had been her son for 32 years. Didn't that count for something? His jaw tightened. Number. He wasn't going to sit here and accept this. If she wouldn't help him willingly, then he would just have to help himself. The next morning, Daniel sat in a coffee shop across from a man he had never met before, Jack Turner, a private investigator. Daniel had spent his last $100 hiring him. If he could figure out where his mother was keeping her money, then maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to fix this. Jack leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee. "So let me get this straight. You want me to find out where your mother's keeping her money?" Daniel nodded. "I just need to know if she has access to it, if she's carrying cash, if she's keeping it in a bank, if she's made any investments." Jack studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "That won't be cheap." "I don't have much," Daniel admitted, "but I can pay you once I get back on my feet." Jack smirked. "That's not how I do business." Daniel's stomach twisted. "Please, I just need something. Anything." Jack exhaled, tapping his fingers against the table. "Fine, I'll run a basic check. If I find anything, we'll talk price." Relief washed over Daniel. "Thank you." Jack stood up, tossing a few bills on the table for his coffee. "I'll be in touch." As Daniel watched him walk away, he felt a mix of hope and guilt churn in his stomach. He wasn't proud of what he was doing, but his mother had left him no choice. A week passed, then another. His eviction deadline loomed closer. He spent his days sending out job applications, searching for anything that could keep him afloat, but nothing was working. Then finally, Jack called. "I found something," he said. Daniel's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "Your mother has a private bank account, recently opened. She's been withdrawing cash regularly but small amounts, never more than a few thousand at a time. Daniel frowned. Why would she do that? Jack chuckled. Because she's smart. She's not keeping all her money in one place. She's probably spreading it out, keeping it liquid. Daniel gritted his teeth. Do you know where she's keeping the cash? Jack hesitated. That's harder to track, but if I had to guess, she's not keeping it in a bank. Daniel's mind raced. His mother had always been cautious. If she wasn't keeping her money in the bank, then where? His eyes widened. The house? She had left their old house behind, but she had always been sentimental. Maybe, just maybe, she had stashed something there. That night, Daniel drove back to the house he had once called home. It was empty now, abandoned. The windows were covered in dust. The porch creaked beneath his weight. He still had the key. He had never bothered to give it back. As he stepped inside, memories flooded him. His mother cooking in the kitchen, sitting together in the living room, watching old movies. He pushed the thoughts away. He didn't have time for nostalgia. He started searching. He checked the bedroom first, pulling open drawers, looking beneath the mattress. Nothing. Then the closet, the attic, still nothing. Frustration grew inside him. Had he been wrong? Then he remembered. His mother's favorite hiding spot, the loose floorboard in the hallway. His heart pounded as he knelt down, prying it open. And there it was, a small metal box. His hands trembled as he pulled it out, flipping it open. Stacks of cash, neatly bundled, thousands of dollars, maybe more. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was his chance. But just as he reached for the money, a voice spoke behind him. I wouldn't do that if I were you. His blood ran cold. He turned slowly. His mother stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression calm, knowing she had been waiting for him. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. Mum, She held up a hand. Don't bother. The silence between them was deafening. Finally, she spoke. I wanted to believe you had changed, Daniel, she said softly. That you had learned something. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. She shook her head. But you didn't come here to make amends. You came here to take what isn't yours. His throat tightened. Mom, No. Her voice was firm. You're not here because you regret what you did. You're here because you're desperate. Daniel's eyes darted to the money. I just need help, that's all. His mother studied him for a long moment. Then, to his shock, she reached into the box, pulled out a small stack of cash, and handed it to him. This is the last thing you'll ever get from me, she said. After this, we're done, completely. Daniel hesitated, his hands shaking. Then slowly, he took the money. His mother exhaled, sadness flickering in her eyes. Goodbye, Daniel. Then she turned and walked away. This time he knew she wasn't coming back, and for the first time, the weight of his actions crushed him completely. Daniel stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, the bundle of cash clutched tightly in his hand. His mother's footsteps faded as she walked away, leaving him in silence. A part of him wanted to call out, to beg her to stay, to tell her that he would change. But he didn't, because deep down, he wasn't sure if he even believed that himself. He exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the money. It wasn't much, maybe a few thousand at most, but it would buy him some time. That was all he needed. Time to figure out his next move. His mother's words echoed in his head. This is the last thing you'll ever get from me. This was it. There was no more safety net, no more second chances. And yet, even as the weight of her finality settled on him, he couldn't shake the thought that had been lingering in the back of his mind since the moment he opened that box. There was more. He knew there had to be. She wouldn't have left all of it here. Not when she had $8 million. This was just a fraction, a small stash for emergencies. So where was the rest? His eyes flickered back to the open floorboard, to the empty space where the box had been hidden. He crouched down, running his hands along the edges of the wooden planks. Maybe there was a second compartment, a deeper hiding spot. Nothing. He checked the walls, tapping lightly to see if any section was hollow. Then the closet, the attic, the basement. Still nothing. Frustration bubbled inside him. His mother wasn't reckless. She was methodical, careful. She wouldn't keep everything in a single place, which meant she had to be keeping it somewhere else. And if he could find out where, his fingers curled into a fist. This wasn't over. 2 days later, Daniel sat in his car outside the small suburban house where his mother now lived. He hadn't seen her leave since that night in the old house, but he knew she would eventually. And when she did, he would be ready. His plan was simple. Wait until she left. Get inside. Find the money. He knew he was crossing a line, but at this point, what choice did he have? His eviction was days away. He had no job, no prospects, nothing to fall back on. She had turned her back on him, and he wasn't going to let her win. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He would get what he deserved, and then he would walk away for good. An hour passed before his patience was rewarded. The front door opened and his mother stepped outside. She locked the door behind her, adjusting the strap of her purse before heading down the driveway. Daniel's heart pounded as he watched her get into a car and drive off. He waited a few minutes, making sure she was gone, then stepped out of his car and made his way to the front door. He pulled a small tool from his pocket. It wasn't the first time he had done something like this. A few years ago, when he was desperate for cash, he had learned how to pick a lock. He hadn't thought he would ever use that skill on his own mother's house, but here he was. It took him less than 30 seconds. The door clicked open. He slipped inside, shutting it behind him. The house was small, tidy, everything in its place. It smelled like fresh coffee and lavender. For a moment, guilt pricked at his chest. Then he pushed it aside. He moved quickly, checking the obvious places first. The drawers in the kitchen, the cabinets, the bedroom closet. Nothing. His frustration grew. Where would she hide it? Then a thought struck him. The garage. His mother had always been sentimental. She had kept boxes of old memories for years. Letters, photographs, childhood drawings. She wouldn't throw those things away. And if she was still holding on to the past, then maybe, just maybe, she was hiding something in plain sight. He made his way to the garage, flipping on the light. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, neatly labeled with dates and descriptions. He moved quickly, scanning them. Then he saw it. A box labeled, "Old Papers, Do Not Throw Away," in his mother's handwriting. His pulse quickened as he knelt down and opened it. At first, it was just what the label promised. Old documents, papers from years ago. Then he saw it. A bank statement. His mother's name was on it, along with an account number and the balance. $7,832,945. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. The account number. The bank. It was all here. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the statement. He had everything he needed. Now all he had to do was figure out how to get to it. That night, Daniel sat in his apartment staring at his phone screen. The account information burned in his mind. He had done some research. The account was at a private bank, one that required in-person transactions for large withdrawals. That meant he couldn't just transfer the money. He needed a way in. His mother would never give him access. But if he could get the right documents, a fake ID, a signature match, something to convince the bank that he had permission to withdraw the funds. It was risky, but the reward? $7 million. A life-changing amount. He could disappear, start over, leave behind everything. His failures, his debts, his past. A clean slate. For the first time in years, he felt hope, real hope. He just had to be smart, careful, and fast. Because once his mother realized the bank statement was missing, she would know exactly what he was planning. And by then, it had to be too late for her to stop him. Across town, Emily Carmichael sat in her living room, a cup of tea in her hands. She stared out the window, deep in thought. She had known, from the moment she saw Daniel in the old house, that he wouldn't stop. That's why she had left that money there. A test, and he had failed it. Her heart ached. She had hoped, prayed, that he would take what she gave him and walk away. But she had seen the look in his eyes, the hunger, the desperation. He wasn't done, and that meant neither was she. She placed her tea down and picked up her phone. Then, with a heavy heart, she dialed a number she had never thought she would need. A man's voice answered. "This is Detective Harper." Emily closed her eyes. "My name is Emily Carmichael," she said softly, "and I need to report a crime before it happens." Daniel paced his apartment, gripping his phone tightly as he scrolled through the images he had taken of his mother's bank statement. His mind raced with possibilities. $7 million. That amount of money would change everything. He could leave behind the eviction notices, the debt collectors, the shame of being a failure. But he needed a plan. The bank required in-person verification for large withdrawals. That meant he had to either convince them he was authorized or forge the necessary documents. He had seen stories of people pulling off scams like this, but it wasn't as simple as walking in and asking for the money. Banks were careful, especially with accounts that held millions. He needed help. There was only one person who might know what to do. Ricky. Daniel hesitated before dialing. Ricky wasn't exactly trustworthy, but he was resourceful. He had connections, people who knew how to get things done. After 3 rings, Ricky picked up. "Danny boy, been a while? You finally ready to make some real money?" Daniel exhaled. "I have a job, a big one." "Yeah? What kind of job?" "I need to access a bank account. There's over $7 million in it. I just need a way to pull out a large sum without setting off alarms." There was silence on the other end, then a low whistle. $7 million? Man, you're not playing around." "I'm serious, Ricky. Can you help me or not?" Ricky chuckled. "You know me. I always have a way." "But something like this? It's tricky. You don't just waltz into a bank and ask for a payout that big." "I know. That's why I need you." There was another pause. "Meet me at Johnny's Diner in an hour. We'll talk." Daniel arrived at Johnny's Diner just before midnight. The place was nearly empty, save for a few late-night customers nursing cups of coffee. He spotted Ricky in a corner booth, smirking as he sipped a soda. Daniel slid into the seat across from him. "What's the plan?" Ricky leaned back, tapping his fingers on the table. "First, I need to know, how legit is this? Whose account is it?" Daniel hesitated. "My mother's." Ricky raised an eyebrow. "Your mother? The same mother who kicked you out?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "She doesn't deserve it. She left me with nothing." Ricky smirked. "Well, if you're sure about that, we have 2 options. 1, we try to forge her authorization. That's risky. Banks cross-check signatures, ask security questions, and if she's already flagged her account, you're done." Daniel's stomach clenched. "And the second option?" Ricky leaned in. "We make her authorize it herself." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Ricky's grin widened. "Ever heard of a little thing called persuasion?" Daniel's pulse quickened. "You're talking about threatening her." "Not in a bad way, just pressure. Maybe tell her you're in trouble, that you need the money now. She's your mother. She'll believe you. If she thinks you're desperate enough, she might cave." Daniel shook his head. "She won't. She already turned her back on me." Ricky sighed. Then we take it up a notch. Make her really think she has no choice. Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had wanted the money, but he hadn't planned on hurting his mother. Ricky smirked. Think about it. If you change your mind, you know where to find me. The next morning, Daniel stood outside his mother's house, his heart pounding. He had told himself he was only here to talk. No threats, no intimidation. Just one last attempt to make her see reason. He knocked on the door. A few moments later, it opened. His mother stood there, her expression unreadable. Daniel. Mom, can we talk? She studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. Come in. He walked inside, the familiar scent of home washing over him. For a split second, he felt like a kid again, running into the house after school. But the warmth faded as soon as he saw the guarded look in her eyes. He cleared his throat. Look, I know we haven't been on the best terms. I know I made mistakes, but I need help. His mother folded her arms. Help? Daniel hesitated. I know about the money, Mom. The $8 million. I found the bank statement. Her face didn't change. She didn't even flinch. And? His stomach twisted. I'm drowning. My apartment. I'm about to get evicted. I have nothing. I just need a little bit to get back on my feet. His mother sighed. Daniel, I already gave you a chance. I left money for you and you took it. That was my final gift to you. It wasn't enough, he snapped, frustration bubbling over. You have millions. You wouldn't even notice if you gave me 50,000. Why are you being so cruel? His mother's gaze hardened. Cruel? She took a slow step forward. You want to talk about cruel, Daniel? You kicked me out of my own home when I was at my lowest. You didn't care where I went. You didn't even ask if I was okay. And now you expect me to hand you money? Daniel clenched his fists. You're my mother. And you were my son, she said quietly. But the boy I raised would never have done what you did. His throat tightened. So that's it? You're just going to abandon me? His mother's eyes softened slightly. No, Daniel, you abandoned me, and now you're dealing with the consequences. Silence stretched between them. Daniel took a shaky breath. You're making a mistake. His mother met his gaze. No, Daniel, you did. He turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. As Daniel drove away, his thoughts churned. He had tried to reason with her. He had tried to be civil, but she had left him no choice. His phone buzzed, a text from Ricky. Still need help? I have a plan. Let me know. Daniel stared at the message, his pulse racing. This wasn't over. Not yet. Daniel sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mother had shut him out. Again. After everything, after all the years he had given her, she had still refused to help him when he needed her the most. The rage inside him built like a storm, and he could feel himself teetering on the edge of something dangerous. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Ricky. You in or not? Time's ticking. Daniel exhaled sharply. He had no job, no home, and no future. Not without that money. He typed back a single word. I'm in. Ricky's plan was simple, but risky. We're not robbing the bank, Ricky explained, sitting across from Daniel in his dimly lit apartment. That's suicide. We just need your mom to authorize a large withdrawal, and if she won't do it willingly, we make her. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. You mean, force her? Ricky smirked. Not with violence, man. Just a little encouragement. The plan was to lure her somewhere isolated, make her think something bad might happen if she didn't comply, and scare her into signing over the money. No physical harm, just fear. Daniel hesitated. He had wanted the money, but he hadn't wanted to hurt his mother. Still, she had given him no choice. If she wasn't going to help him willingly, he'd make her. The night air was crisp, as Daniel pulled up outside his mother's house. The street was quiet, most of the neighbors already asleep. He took a deep breath and texted Ricky, "Here, you ready?" A few seconds later, Ricky responded, "Yeah, knock on the door, tell her you want to talk. We'll handle the rest." Daniel swallowed hard. His hands were clammy as he stepped onto the porch and knocked. A few moments later, the door creaked open. His mother stood there looking weary but unsurprised. "What do you want, Daniel?" "I just want to talk," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Please." She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine, come in." He stepped inside, glancing toward the shadows near the side of the house, where Ricky and his guys were waiting. He had told himself this wasn't crossing a line, it was just business, just survival. But as soon as the door closed, his mother spoke again, and her words sent a chill down his spine. "I know what you're planning." Daniel froze. She turned to face him fully, her expression calm but sharp. "I saw Ricky's car parked down the street earlier, and I know you, Daniel. I know that look in your eyes." His throat tightened. I don't know what you're talking about." She nodded slowly. "You really think I'm stupid?" Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He had planned to convince her, to scare her if necessary, but now she was in control of the conversation. "I didn't want it to come to this," he said finally, "but you left me no choice." His mother exhaled, looking almost disappointed. "No choice? That's the same excuse you gave when you threw me out." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but suddenly a blaring siren pierced the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. His stomach dropped. Outside, several police cars screeched to a stop in front of the house. Officers spilled out, guns drawn. His mother folded her arms. "I called them earlier," she said, her voice steady. "Told them I had a feeling my son was about to do something stupid." Daniel's mind raced. Ricky, the guys outside. If they saw the cops. Gunshots rang out. Daniel's body went cold. He ran to the window in time to see Ricky and one of his guys sprinting down the street, bullets flying past them as officers took cover behind their cars. Ricky managed to disappear into an alley, but the other guy wasn't so lucky. He hit the pavement hard, officers surrounding him within seconds. Daniel turned back to his mother, his voice shaking. You set me up?" She shook her head. "No, Daniel, you set yourself up." Heavy boots pounded up the porch steps. The front door burst open, and suddenly, Daniel was on the ground, an officer's knee pressing into his back as cold metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. As they hauled him to his feet, he locked eyes with his mother one last time. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't smug, she just looked sad, and that, more than anything, shattered him. The trial was quick. With the evidence against him, the texts, the attempted fraud, the threats, Daniel had no defense. Ricky had vanished, leaving him to take the fall alone. The judge handed down a 5-year sentence. As he sat in his prison cell, Daniel had plenty of time to think about the moment he kicked his mother out, about the choices he made after that, about how, no matter how much he had tried to justify his actions, he had been wrong, completely, utterly wrong. His mother had given him everything, and when she had needed him, he had turned his back on her, and now he had lost everything. The day of his release, 5 years later, Daniel stepped out of the prison gates, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He had no home, no money, no idea what to do next. But waiting outside, sitting on a bench near the parking lot, was his mother. Older now. Grey streaked her once dark hair. She stood as he approached, her face unreadable. Daniel swallowed hard. "Mom?" She studied him for a long moment, then said, "Are you hungry?" Tears burned his eyes. He nodded. She sighed. "Let's go eat." And for the first time in years, Daniel felt hope. Some lessons are learned the hard way, and some mistakes leave scars that never truly fade. But no matter how lost we become, sometimes, just sometimes, the people who love us still find a way to bring us home. This is Stories of Hope. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life lessons.